Compressors are being used by audio recording studios throughout the world as a tool to shape the dynamics of an audio recording. Therefore, it could be categorized as a dynamic processor or a dynamic effect. Normally, a compressor is being used as an insert effect, and that means it will just affect one sound on the channel that it's being inserted on. So for example, a compressor could be inserted onto a vocal track. Whereas the vocalist would get too loud, the compressor would automatically reduce the volume of that vocal track. Let's take a look at the compressor's basic overview. A compressor reduces the amount of level on an audio track, just like you would do with the fader on a mixing console. But the compressor does this a lot faster than you would be able to do this manually. The basic idea of a compressor is that you set a threshold. When the level of your audio signal reaches that threshold and gets over it, the compressor actually starts working and starts compressing. The amount of compression that takes place is what you set with the ratio, and that ratio determines the amount of compression above the threshold. I think you can clearly see that with this animation right here. So the easiest way to explain what a compressor does is to say that it makes loud sounds softer. That's what the traditional compressor does. So these are the first functions and settings of a compressor. First you start off with the threshold. Make sure that the level gets over the threshold or else the compressor won't work. So make sure that you lower the threshold if the compressor doesn't do anything. And the next step is to set the ratio, and that determines how hard the compressor works. So a ratio of 2 to 1 means that for every 2 decibels above the threshold, only 1 will be outputted by the compressor. And a ratio of 20 to 1 means for every 20 decibels above the threshold, only 1 will come out. So that's a hard compression type. And if you compare that with 2 to 1, that would be soft compression. And a ratio of 1 to 1 means basically for every 1 dB above the threshold, 1 will come out. So that's a neutral position and you will have no compression at all. Here I'm playing an original drum track with no compression on it. And now compress with ratio 2. Ratio 4. Ratio 10. And here we keep ratio 10, but we lower the threshold even more. As you could hear, the sound got a lot softer when we applied the ratio 10 at the end, especially when we lowered the threshold. That's because we just used the threshold and the ratio setting of this compressor, and I didn't look at any of the other settings yet. So what I haven't looked at yet is that we can now compensate the amount of compression or gain reduction that occurred by applying makeup gain or compensational gain, as whatever manufacturer would call that. So here's the original drums. And here we listen to the compressed drums, but with makeup gain. So we actually compress it with a ratio 10, and then we bring up the level to match the original inputs level. So what has happened here is that we reduced the amount of dynamic range. We made the loud sounds softer, a lot softer. So we brought them closer to the soft sounds, like the hi-hat, and then we brought up the volume of the overall drums back. So basically what we did is that we brought the soft sounds and the loud sounds closer together, and you can really hear that it sounds more aggressive in this way. And one function I haven't mentioned earlier is the knee setting that certain compressors have. A knee setting allows you to choose between soft knee and hard knee, and sometimes they even have a slider for between soft and hard knee. And the difference between them is that soft knee actually applies an increasing ratio, which works a little bit before the threshold, so it gently applies the compression. When you have a compressor with a hard knee function, it means that whenever you reach the threshold, it really applies the ratio the way that you've set it, instead of the soft knee, which gently applies it and smooths out the effect of compression taking place. So the hard knee definitely will be more noticeable of an effect, and when it takes place you can really hear the compressor start to work, as opposed to soft knee where it gently increases the amount of compression. We've seen the most basic controls that a compressor has. That be the threshold, which sets the level at which it starts working, and then the ratio of how hard the compressor works on the signal that needs to be compressed. And then we have the makeup gain, which compensates for the amount of compression. There's two other things that are really important of setting up a compressor, and that is the so-called attack and release time. And these are settings which work on an amount of time set in milliseconds. Some compressors actually offer you an option fast attack or slow attack or auto release or these things, but it's always something similar to that. The attack time on a compressor determines how fast the compressor applies the compression when the signal gets over the threshold, where the release actually tells how long it takes for the compressor to stop compressing when the level drops below the threshold again. So that's basically the attack and release time. But they're really important of setting how fast will the compressor actually work. So if we got a snare drum and we set a compressor on it with a really slow attack time, the compressor will barely or probably not work at all because it's too slow. So the attack time determines how fast the compressor starts to work. I'm going to show you an example so you can hear and see it at the same time. I'm changing the attack time, and as I do that you can really hear the effect on the kick and the snare drum, especially in the punch.
Actual audio that moves from high to low is called a transient, and these happen over time, obviously. So what the attack and release time actually do is they assign when the compressor starts to actually cut at that transient. When you have it at 0, as soon as it hears that transient, it's going to try to bring it down. If we delay that attack just a little bit, maybe 1 millisecond, it'll actually hear that transient, and then it'll wait a moment, and then it'll start to cut. So this is a full drum, as you can hear. Let's give this a play. As you can see, it's kind of boxy. It's one big chunk of audio. But if we want the initial section of this clip to be very punchy and the later section to be quieter, to have a shorter sample, we can actually do this with the attack time here. So if we assign this to, let's say, a 2 millisecond attack time, 2, and then we assign the ratio something high, like let's say a 4:1, so we're getting a decent cut out of it. Then we can actually go ahead and freeze this channel, and you can see exactly what this does. And as you can see, the initial section here is a little bit louder. I think the makeup gain was a little bit too high because we had it set for that vocal. So I'm going to go ahead and go back twice, and then we'll actually set that makeup gain down, maybe to a negative value. And then we're actually going to freeze. And as you can see, now the kick has a little bit more of a curved shape. It looks more like a triangle, if you will. The initial section is harder thwack, and the lower section here is essentially less volume. So like the attack time, the release time of a compressor deals with time-based values. So the release time is the amount of time it takes for the compressor to turn off once it is engaged. If we turn this down to, like, let's say a 25, you can see that the waveform is going to start loud, come down, and then bring back up. Let's actually bring that threshold down a little bit here, bring the volume down to a -5 so it's more noticeable here. -5, not 5, because we don't want it to clip. And then we want to freeze, flatten. And as you can see, the latter half of this waveform is actually gradually louder than the middle here. That's because of that release time difference, because the compression is only going to work for a certain period of time and then it is turned off. If we even bring that down a little bit more, let's say like a 15, we can actually see that even more. Let's give this a freeze. Let's give this a flatten. And as you can see, this is a little bit louder than this section here.
And out. This is the input level before compression. Then we have the GR, or gain reduction, and that's the amount of actual compression taking place. And then we have the output level. So if we have no gain makeup and quite a lot of compression, the output should be a lot softer than the input. And I can demonstrate that by lowering the threshold, increasing the ratio a bit, and
we're gonna tear it apart now. We're gonna tear it apart now.
You can see there's a decent amount of dynamic range in the input. There's a lot of gain reduction. Therefore, the output is a lot softer because we're compressing a hell of a lot.
So if I'm going back and go to a more decent ratio right here, around 3, go back to the threshold around 20.
We're gonna tear it apart now. We're gonna tear it apart now.
On the peaks I've got around 6.7 dB of gain reduction, and in the average
We're gonna tear it apart now.
I've got 3 to 4 dB of gain reduction. So I'm going to add a little bit of gain makeup to compensate for the compression taking place. So I'm going to add around 4 or 5 dB of gain makeup, because I've got so much headroom left in this recording. I could actually boost it a little bit with the compressor.
We're gonna tear it apart now. We're gonna tear it apart now.
That is with the compression and the gain makeup. I'm going to listen to both and A/B compare it with both of them, with and without compression.
We're gonna tear it apart now. We're gonna tear it apart now. We're gonna tear it apart now. We're gonna tear it apart now.